Our special guests for today, we are thrilled to have them. I know that you all are going to be soaking up their brilliance this whole time as I have been in preparation for this conversation. We have two folks from Diversity Talks here with us, Brenda Viles. She is her, and she's a curriculum specialist at Diversity Talks. She does tons of work with students that we're going to get to learn from today. We also have Molly Cohen here, her Director of Strategic Partnerships for Diversity Talks, and we can't wait to learn from her as well, from all of her work. So welcome, Molly, welcome, Brenda. Just can't wait for this talk today. Woo! Want to tell you a little bit about Diversity Talks just to kick us off. So Brenda, Molly, do you want to tell us about what your organization does?
Yeah, thanks, Tori. We're so excited to be here with you all tonight. Brenda and I are here from Diversity Talks, which is an organization that focuses on youth-led professional development. So that means our rockstar high school age young people are the ones facilitating conversations for adults around topics of identity, power, justice, and accountability. So our organization does this in a whole host of ways, from youth-led workshops and keynotes to fellowships for young people and for educators. Brenda leads our National Abolitionist Leader Fellowship for teachers from around the country. We also do a lot of intensive research work, whether that's at the individual level, looking at people's individual cultural competency development, or focusing on organizational culture and research there. And then lastly, we do a lot to provide anti-racism training and resources, trying to make sure that everybody has shared vocabulary, shared resources, and the tools to address these systems and structures in their own schools or workplaces.
Incredible work. We cannot wait to hear more about what you do and learn from all the work that you've done with students. Great. Hello, everybody who's just joining us. So good to see you. We are going to just share now in the chat a link to a resources document, and it has a couple of things on it. All of the stuff that is in that document is part of us chasing this question that's on the screen. How can we support authentic student leadership in our efforts to create equitable learning spaces? So that's what we're going to be talking about today. There's a couple of resources at the top, including some freebies that Diversity Talks has been kind enough to give us all access to today. There's some breakout room discussion prompts that we're going to use in a little bit. And on page 2, there's some information that you can reference that sort of will go along with our discussion in just a little bit. All right. If you have any questions, drop them in the chat. We're going to get moving. So to kick off our conversation, just want to kind of give you a preview of where we're going to be headed, and then we are going to dive in to just listening and learning from all the great stuff that Molly and Brenda are going to bring to this conversation. So we're going to start out talking a bit about how features of white supremacy culture show up in classrooms and schools and the work we can do to unlearn them. Then we're going to turn our attention to this second question about authentic youth leadership. And Brenda and Molly are going to share a lot about their work with students and what we can learn from that work, as well as thinking about how youth can really be partners in this work, true partners. And our last question will be about sort of the work that we have to do as educators, the learning and also the unlearning that we have to do. So beliefs, mindsets, what do we have to prepare to, what do we have to personally divest from before we can really start this work or to support this work of student leadership? So that's just a little preview. Would love to kick us off. Brenda, Molly, tell us a little bit, how are you defining white supremacy culture? How does this show up in schools, and what can we do about it?
Yeah, thanks, Tori. Well, we wanted to ground the conversation in talking about white supremacy culture, really thinking about those norms, those practices that are in place that sustain this system of hierarchy that privileges white folks and privileges white supremacy. And so we know Tema Okun has this amazing framework that breaks it down into really concrete practices, whether that's defensiveness, whether that's conflict avoidance. And the idea is that all of these practices add up to a climate where the folks who are in power, the folks who have privilege, are not questioned, are not challenged, and are able to sustain that privilege through day-to-day actions that are just accepted as cultural norms that are widely seen as just natural or unquestionable. And so Brenda and I wanted to start the conversation thinking about, okay, well, knowing that that white supremacy culture shows up across all of our systems. It shows up in our classrooms. It shows up in our schools, in our district policies. What does that mean for educators who are in a position in the classroom, or for, administrators in their schools, to be able to recognize and start to disrupt some of those patterns? And how does that connect to this question of authentic youth leadership?
Brenda, what are you thinking about as you think about how this shows up? And I love this phrase that Molly mentioned: recognize and disrupt. What are you thinking about?
So one of the things that I often talk about is being able to name what's happening. And oftentimes people of color are feeling disempowered, but we can't name why that is. And so I think it's important that we have the language to name, because until we can do that, then we cannot interrupt these patterns that cause harm and that keep people limited, right, and disempowered. And this idea of there being a status quo and everybody having to measure that particular status quo, whatever those requirements are, those values, those practices, and as that being seen as the only way, is part of what has hindered, right, our expansion and growth. And so that's the frame that I try to come in with. The lens that I try to use is, let's name it so that we can then interrupt it.
And that's really interesting, Brenda, because it makes me think about, I was kind of curious with those three framing questions for folks who are here at the outset. We had questions around, how does youth leadership show up at your school? How does white supremacy culture show up at your school? And one pattern that I was noticing in how folks were engaging in the chat is it's really easy, or it seems really natural for folks in the room to be able to pinpoint, oh, we have XYZ structures in place to support youth leadership, or we know we don't have structures in place in our school to pinpoint youth leadership. And I'm not sure that folks have the same lenses or are supported to develop the same lenses often around how is white supremacy culture showing up in my school, or what practices are in place that are reinforcing that. So I think your point about visibility and being able to have language is such a good one, Brenda, because it's like, oh, okay, well, if there are, what we recognize, we can either reinforce or disrupt. But the thing about white supremacy culture and the way it shows up in schools is it's so pervasive. It's so hard to recognize. It's so not part of what, the way we prepare educators to understand what should or shouldn't be in place in a school, that it's not something that is going to rise right to the surface for most folks when they're thinking about what does it mean to be effective in their role, or to, do good in their classroom.
It's also the norm. And so when it's your norm, it doesn't seem like there's anything different to be done. And it's when that norm is questioned that, either you push back or you sort of sit with it and consider that there could be a different possibility for what's happening. And so oftentimes it's business as usual, right? Well, this is how it's always been, or I've always done it this way. What are you talking about? And so it denies someone else's lived experience of, a variety of things: microaggressions, gatekeeping, all of those things.
And what I think one of the biggest, I think one of the most powerful parts about the work that we do is how much of a impact it has, especially for educators, when you have youth-led, like truly youth-led workshops or truly youth-led spaces, because that's a space where you're asking somebody, not just through conversation questions, to interrogate, how do I engage with power, and who do I recognize as an expert, or who do I believe is capable of being a leader? But in real time, if there is a 14-year-old who is challenging your thinking, or asking you to use pronouns and you're not used to or comfortable with that language, you in real time are going to have to interrogate, well, do I see this person as the leader? Do I treat this person as a facilitator? Do I respect them as, an equal, or in the leadership role that they're holding? Or am I going to fall back on what I've been taught to believe about their capabilities, or my own beliefs about what this power dynamic is supposed to look like? I know. You said something earlier, Brenda, that I want you to share again here around this idea of managing behavior and of policing. Can I tee you up for that?
Sure, sure. I was going to also say that a lot of the times, our training tells us that we have to be the sage on the stage. And so we subscribe to a power dynamic of I am the adult and I know what is best, which is paternalism. If you're going to look at the characteristics, right? It's paternalism. I know best. I tell you what to do. You're here to learn from me. And so when that goes unchallenged, right, you find that's how you perpetuate white supremacist culture, because now you're teaching your students that they have to submit to a hierarchy and that they are not seen as valid participants of their own learning, that they don't have a voice in their learning because you're there to give them everything they need to know. So I wanted to also talk about how that hierarchy and that way of thinking and that power hoarding perpetuates this system, particularly when we subscribe to it. And so for me, part of the challenge was when I had to stop seeing myself as the authority in the room, and I had to see myself as the facilitator in the room. I'm there to facilitate learning. And I have to be open to learning from my students because surely they have something to teach me about their lived experience. So, that's one thing to consider. In terms of, Molly, refresh my memory again, policing. The other part of that is when we start to subscribe to this hierarchy, we start to sort of check in on our kids. Well, did you hand this in? And where is this assignment? And did you do that? Without interrogating if there could possibly be a need or an obstacle. It's the assumption. And then that lets us, it puts us into the biases that we subscribe to. And then that shows up. And then we create these stories about, oh, this kid is lazy, this kid is irresponsible. And we disempower them, right, from participating. And so we're sort of talking at kids and not talking to kids, and just using old ways and old systems. And what abolition invites you to do is to create a new way.
Create a new way. Yes, Brenda. And you got lots of love in the chat for some of the things that you were just sharing. Sorry, Molly, go ahead.
I was just going to share that earlier you were talking about this, Brenda, and you were saying, well, what would happen if you just didn't police your classroom?
Right. So yeah, I had a teacher that I was coaching, and she was like, I feel like a police officer. I'm constantly doing this, that, and the other. And she was a member of this abolitionist fellowship that we were leading. And I asked her that question, like, so what would happen if you didn't? Like, who's gonna come get you if you don't do that anymore? And what's the harm in asking, is there a way that I can support you? Or is there an obstacle? Or maybe it's even like giving them permission to not be interested in your assignment because your assignment is boring. Like that's also a possibility. Like let them have an opinion about what you're doing and be open to receiving feedback from your students.
And I think that the defensiveness piece is so big to me there too, because so much of there's such a relationship between like, oh, if I believe my role is to control a classroom space, then any challenge to that control is a challenge to my effectiveness, is a challenge to, my capabilities as the leader of this space, is a threat to safety of my classroom, whatever the underlying belief is there. And so we see so often in these youth-led workshops and these youth-led spaces that there's an innate reaction that's so, and like I am not divested from defensiveness myself. Like I am definitely still working on unlearning that like innate, like, oh, if you're questioning me, only one of us can be right, and it's got to be me because that's my role in this space is to be the one who is right and has the answers.
And I just want to add, right, like there's a thing, I'm sorry, Tori, I get excited, right? Because we have these espoused beliefs and we think we believe a thing. And because we think we believe a thing, we think that's not me immediately. However, what you believe is what actually shows up. The way that you behave and act in your classroom is what really speaks to what you believe. You may not want to believe that, but that's what shows up. And that's what we're asking you to interrogate, right? Like, where is this coming from? What's the root of this belief? So that you can then pull that root out and maybe do something beautiful and different and new.
Right. Like this idea that knowing better is important, And knowing better is not the same as doing better.
Listen, y'all can read all the books. It doesn't matter. You can know all the things. None of that matters. What matters is, what action are you taking? And it doesn't have to be like nobody, we're not asking you to burn down the building yet. However, what we are asking you to do is just take one small action. Don't police your students today. What would that feel like? Ask a child, what do you need in this moment? Right? Like, do something different that will sort of get you used to being in that uncomfortable zone of releasing some of that power that you think you have, or that makes you feel good or in control.
And so often there's that ego in the room around like, oh, well, I don't want to be like, I'm not racist. That's not me. And so therefore, even if this student is pointing out something that I'm doing that is causing harm and reinforcing racism, if I don't believe that's who I am, then I'm not going to be open to receiving that. And I'm not going to be able to engage with that productively. And I'm going to slip back into that control mindset. So there's so much about, like, to me, being able to trust the expertise and the lived experiences of students in the classroom means recognizing that, like, if they are giving you feedback or if they are reacting to you in a way that is giving you information that you are doing harm or you are reinforcing these systems of oppression, like being open to that message and trusting that they know what they are experiencing more than you know even if you know what your intentions are, they know the impact of it much better than you do.
Yes to that. They know the impact. All what you all are saying too, just looking at these sample characteristics you pulled out: defensiveness, right to comfort, power hoarding, perfectionism, like how mutually reinforcing those characteristics are, right? Like this control, but also not wanting to make mistakes, and also who gets to be comfortable. Is it me? Is it students? Like you're saying, Molly, how are students really feeling? Can they share? Can they tell, honestly, the impact? So powerful. I want to move us to the next question because it's just such, I think, a powerful one. And we want to start talking a bit about what authentic youth leadership really looks like. So share with us, tell us about sort of what can this really look like in practice? What small steps, bigger steps can we take to really start this work? And how can we view youth as partners in this work?
So this is a question that I have been exploring a lot with my teachers lately during my coaching sessions, because they don't want to relinquish their power, right? Because they are the sage on the stage, and they also have, like, standards and curriculum and scopes and sequences that they have to sort of, engage and meet. And I think that the pandemic actually gave us an opportunity to sort of say it's okay to walk away from this thing and actually check in with my student. Like, they're humans, and they have human needs, and they need to be seen. Oftentimes when we are just trucking through our curriculum, we forget to see the students that are there before us. So I'm just going to share a few examples of what it looks like. For my fellowship, the most impactful part of the fellowship, we started out by doing seminars at the beginning of the year, followed up by coaching. And the seminars were initially some adult-led seminars and then 5 youth-led seminars. And the most impactful piece was the youth-led seminars, because it demonstrated to teachers that youth can actually facilitate. They actually have a lot of language to talk about what white supremacy culture has done to them, how it's impacted them, how it's disempowered them, and how they're looking to do something different because they want to be seen and they want to share their experiences. So initially, teachers came in with this limited mindset. And now, of course, that it's coaching time. It's like, okay, so now you got to do something. What are you going to do? And 2 things that stand out. We had one teacher who decided that she was going to go to the Black Student Union and ask upperclassmen to come into her classroom and talk about how they best learn. What can she do? What and to then lead a lesson on how they learn and what they need versus what she thinks they need. Right. So this is what you think I needed, but this is what I actually needed. And these are the conditions under which I learn best. Right. These are the partnerships or the styles that really benefit me. And so that was really empowering, because when I observed her, her initial fear was, I don't want to lose control of this classroom. How do I manage? And she was so focused on managing that she was missing some really beautiful opportunities to give students a voice. So that's one example of a way, two examples, right? The youth-led facilitation that happens at DT, and then also having teachers sort of switch it up. I had another teacher who decided to create a student council that would provide feedback on learning, assessing, and working styles. Prior to the fellowship, that wasn't even something that she had even considered, right? And so now there's an opportunity for student voice to say, these lessons, the way that these are presented just doesn't work. Or how about if we did more group work, or maybe we want to do project-based work, right? But giving them a voice. And she's the lone soldier doing this at her school, right? But it's because she wants to now empower her students, because she sees what's possible after seeing them lead with us. So those are just some examples of what it could look like authentically.
And I love, like, my heart just glows when you talk about this, the role of student council, because I think that's such a powerful example of the difference. To me, what's so striking about what that teacher you shared about is doing is the level of depth of what she's asking her student council to engage with. I think there's such a difference. Like, you can have structures for student voice, but if the thing that your student council is tasked with is primarily like planning an event, or figuring out decorations and hallways, like, there are levels of true agency and true representation that groups of students can hold in a school building. Like, are we asking them to weigh in on policy decisions? Are we inviting them to give feedback on teaching and learning that's happening in the school? Or are we, creating an opportunity to make them feel more empowered without actually giving them any access to structural power in the building? I think, like, there are some schools that are putting a lot of time and love into creating platforms for student voice, which, without really thinking about how does this actually genuinely create agency for students, or does it just make them feel like they have agency?
Right. It's a false sense of power.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
It's, I'm going to pretend that you have power, but you're really not. And a lot of the times, a lot of these student councils are around, who's going to be class president, we got to do senior prom planning. And it continues to, diminish where the real power structures are that need to be interrupted. And oftentimes it's at your school district or at the community level, right? That's where the friction lies. And then it's also this idea that, it's convenient for students to have voice when you're okay with it. So I'm okay with you running for student class president or for prom leadership or whatever. But if you're going to go out there and start protesting and aligning yourselves with Black Lives Matter, then hold up, someone's been poisoning the well.
Mm-hmm.
Because imagine a student having their own opinion about the injustices that they're witnessing with their own eyes, as if they don't have opinions, right? So it's also about that false sense of you have a voice, but not for the important things, just for the frivolous or superficial things. And so it's about really going deeper than that. And you have to be willing to give up some of your privileges. And I'm not just talking about white privileges, but power privileges, leadership privileges, comfort privileges. So, it's a lot deeper than just saying, oh, I'll do a little counsel. Well, what's the real goal and purpose of that? What are you trying to interrogate, and what are you trying to interrupt?
Mm. Yeah, and so often it just makes me think about, we, as an organization, Diversity Talks, we run this amazing Liberation Leader Fellowship for our youth. They go through all of this training over the summer. They get coaching over the course of the year so that we can support them to lead these types of workshops for their teachers. And we often talk to schools or talk to districts where they're like, oh, this is such an empowering program. We're really excited to bring this in. We want to help build up our students and create this leadership opportunity. And then when we say, okay, great, so let's talk about this cohort of teachers who are going to go through professional development that their own youth are going to facilitate for them. They're like, oh, well, we're not really here for the adult learning piece. We really want the student power piece. Like, we really care about creating a platform for the youth. And the question for me is always like, okay, well, what what is the true platform here if your youth aren't going to get to actually challenge their own teachers or apply these lessons in their own building? So as an organization, we have to be really thoughtful about how do we make sure we're partnering with schools and with districts in a way that is not just going to make youth feel like they have a voice until at the end of the day, like you're saying, Brenda, their opinion is tested against what the school district believes, the line should be or is appropriate for school day or this or that. Like, how do we make sure we're never going in unless we're setting up students to actually have leadership in a space and be able to vocalize their own experiences or their own beliefs?
But also, Molly, be able to accept being challenged by the youth.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So how often are we in workshops and the adults are offended that the youth have told them a truth that they're not ready to hear? And so, it can't all just be glitter and gold. It doesn't work that way. You have to sit with the discomfort, right, of how you have participated in oppression or in white supremacist culture.
Yeah, I feel like that for me, like learning to embrace that discomfort has been the most critical piece of it, because I feel like growing up as a white person in a white supremacy culture, to me, if something starts to feel uncomfortable, it's like, oh, okay, that's like a warning sign. You don't go there. Like that means you have to end this conversation or you have to remove yourself or this is not productive. And learning to recognize like, oh, the point of our workshops is that we hold space for productive discomfort. We want people to get to that place of feeling challenged, of having their beliefs interrogated, of recognizing parts of themselves that actually are out of alignment with their values, of recognizing where their actions don't match their beliefs. Because if they're not going to get to that place of recognizing it, then they're not going to be able to change it. They're not going to be able to do anything about it. And so it's like, you can't get to a place of disruption unless you're willing to sit with that discomfort. And I think that is where so many, where like the real courage of leadership in schools and in districts is so important, because there's going to be people in the room who are unhappy because they're in their feelings and they're in that emotional space.
I mean, sometimes I just think about how upset teachers get right over curriculum. Oh, the outrage, the curriculum. And you want your voice to be heard. And I remember being that teacher, like, why wasn't I consulted? How come I wasn't a part of this decision-making? I'm the one who's actually teaching, right? And you feel indignant, right? And so you know what it's like to tap into that. But then when students do it, it's almost like, how dare you? How dare you behave the way I behave? Right? So it's also being able to look at yourself in the mirror and also give them an opportunity to vocalize themselves.
Makes it real, Brenda, when you say that example or examples like it, right, where like we don't feel our own voice being heard, and tapping into that and tapping into what that means for this work is a really powerful thing. Thank you. So we've kind of been dancing around this question, our last question. I'm going to share it on the screen quickly about sort of the work that we can do to start this work that you are talking about. And we've been talking about some of these things like beliefs, mindsets that we need to really divest from before we can start this work or continue to divest from, right? This work is not just done. So talk to us a little bit about your guidance about this question about beliefs and mindsets. What can we do?
Well, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind, I feel like I fixate right on that, right to comfort and fear of conflict one. Maybe that's because that's just my own growth area. But I think it feels like so often there's this pattern of learning, especially for white educators going through these kinds of like this identity development and learning to recognize these systems of oppression, where at first that right to comfort is the barrier. Like we were just talking about, that discomfort is what holds you back. If you're not able to engage with it, then you're not going to be able to understand what are the beliefs that you're holding on to that are actually harmful for your students. And then I see so often that once educators or folks who are a little bit further along in that journey and who feel like, oh, okay, I understand what white supremacy culture is. I've done my DEI training. I've gone to my workshops. I get it. It's really interesting to see those folks in our workshops come in, and some of them can go through and say, well, I've been through trainings like this before. I didn't learn anything new. And we're seeing these folks in a space where their colleagues are, earlier in their learning journeys or are sharing things in the workshop space that are harmful and need to be challenged. And to me, the question always is, okay, well, if you feel like you are further along and you understand this stuff, like you are holding on tight to that fear of conflict. If you're not recognizing your role is now to look at who are your peers and your colleagues that you are accountable for, who don't know as much or who need to be challenged, or, who are maybe they're not teaching in the same classroom as you, but you're in a position to disrupt them. And I think there's this, there's like first the responsibility for your own learning, but I think often for white folks, we don't recognize that we're also accountable for making sure that we're using the privilege that we hold to start to disrupt and challenge and bring along our own colleagues once we're in a position to do that.
Yeah, I'm going to add a few items here. One of the first things that you can do is actually go through that list and check off what you subscribe to, what you've held up. Perfectionism is usually a popular one for teachers, right? Your lessons have to be perfect. Your timing has to be, like, all of these things that we have been taught to hold on to, right? So go through the list, definitely see how you've enacted some of that. A book I recommend is Me and White Supremacy by Layla Saad, because she also points out like some of the things Molly talked about, right? White silence. I say I know, but then I don't interrupt because I'm conflict averse. Or exceptionalism. Oh, I'm not one of those white people. I don't do that. I know all the things, right? And that leaves a lot of room for error. I think we also have to divest from being good. Like, oh, but I'm good, right? And you can still cause harm, right? I'm a good mom, but I've certainly made some mistakes with my daughter. My daughter would not tell you that I'm perfect. And so we have to sort of start dancing with some of this. It can be overwhelming, but it's just one step at a time. For me, when I first started at Diversity Talks, Molly, you'll remember, I missed my 9 to 5. I was like, whoa, I get to do whatever I want, whenever I want, however I want, and so it's really starting to shift. When I was a teacher, I started off being a very authoritative teacher because I thought that was what my students needed, right? Structure and order and all these things. And I had to then transition to becoming a facilitator of learning. And that took a long time, and I was uncomfortable with letting the kids lead and having them teach me. And there were times in math when they knew more than I did, and I was embarrassed. I was like, OMG, and so being able to sit through that. So those are some things that you can start off by doing, and interrogating your biases, right? Like, how does my body respond to something? Because your body is usually the one that lets you know. Do you get tense? Do you sort of get alarmed? Do you start to sweat? Do your palms get clammy? Like, your body lets you know what's up. So just start paying attention and make room for the possibility, right? Because a lot of the times, like, no, I'm good. I don't do that. I'm not racist. I'm not this. I'm not that. Make room for the possibility. Like, oh, we're all swimming in this. There's got to be something I'm subscribing to that I can surely divest from.
And I know you're going to move us and be responsible about time, Tori, but the last thing I just want to add is I think there's often the impulse to jump right to action and jump right to, okay, but what do I need to be doing? What are the behaviors I need to change? And I know we said it's about the behaviors, but the shortcut that we can't afford to take is focusing only on our actions and not on interrogating our beliefs and mindsets and the underlying pieces, because so often we see people who are like, yeah. Like I've learned the 101 stuff. I'm ready. I need the lesson plans. I need the tools. I want the concrete things. I'm ready for action. But like we all have a lifetime of unlearning ahead of us. And so if we're not working on ourselves individually at the same time that we're working on our practices, then we're not going to be people who can be advocates for and allies with our students. We're going to continue to, be holding on to those beliefs and investing in white supremacy culture at the same time that we're trying to elevate young people who are in a position to disrupt it.
The first question is, what would you recommend for teachers of K-2 students to helps turn students into facilitators? What advice do you have for our early childhood folks?
Right. So I know folks are coming in from all over the country, and I live, born and bred in New York City, so I have the privilege of, you know, being around a lot of progressive thinking. And so a lot of the things that I've been seeing in classrooms throughout have been, doing work around identity, starting there so that children can actually speak to their experiences, speak to their values, speak to, their lives. And so making room for their stories. And I know that K2 teachers are like, these kids could ask questions for days. I'd never get through a lesson. But maybe just creating a designated time in the week or in the quarter, or just to give them an opportunity to feel important. Kind of like, we used to do show and tell back in the day, just giving them an opportunity to share their experiences, and also do work around identity, because we're really talking about cultural inclusion as well. I think that a lot of us came in during the time of assimilation, and that meant that we had to repress and suppress who we were culturally and assimilate to this American way, which just upheld a lot of white supremacist practices that didn't serve us. And so giving children an opportunity to give opinions, right? To share experiences is a small way of getting started. I know that one of the schools I work with has an actual identity unit for K. And then they revisit it again in 5th grade because their identity has shifted, right, in those 5 years. So that's something. There is also the text that you use as a way to sort of address, some of the things that we're sort of talking about, and also just how you engage. Like, are you in relationship with your students, even at K2, or are they just the little people that you have to instruct? Right. So also thinking about, how do I build relationship with my little people? How do I get to know who they really are? A lot of the things that happened during COVID was that teachers became aware of the hardships that students were dealing with, sharing a laptop, or chaos in the background, or a shared space. And so making room for their humanity as well, even as little as K2. Like, it's not that they're not trying, it's not that they're not, that they're too distracted, but actually asking, what do you need at this moment? So those are just some things. Maybe not satisfy the question to the degree that maybe you wanted, but we can always talk offline about that.
Amazing offer, thank you. We had another post-it in the Padlet about reading, writing, and racism, which you both were like, "Ooh, cool." It's a book, I believe. Can you talk to us about it?
Yes. So Reading, Writing, and Racism was the book that we actually used in the fellowship that we just had this year. And the reason that book is so important is because it actually names how whiteness and white supremacy seeps into our curriculum, which ties in beautifully to this question that's in the chat around derogatory text in books, which I'll get to. But, it names all of the ways. Whiteout is one of the ways, not that bad is one of the ways. So all of these ways that we're used to subscribing to alleviate the discomfort of facing what we've actually subscribed to and perpetrated. So I really love that book for teachers as a way to sort of be able to name. Again, language is really important. You can't interrupt it until you can name it. And if you find something that is problematic, you now have a name for it, and you can say, I'm not going to do this because this is what's happening. This is the evidence. What are you going to do? And put the onus back on your administration. So, reading, writing, and racism, yes, all the way.
And Courtney's question about addressing derogatory texts in books. Any thoughts on that from either of you?
Yeah, like, why are we still reading books with derogatory text? That's the first thing, right? And 2 is having a really honest conversation about why the language is problematic. Because if your parents aren't willing to school you at home, then that it somehow becomes my job, right? And then y'all get mad, but like, why are we still engaging with this text that is problematic? That's one thing.
We are somehow running almost to the top of the hour, and I know that you all are educators who have full lives and things that you need to do. So if you have additional, go ahead and pop them in chat, or if you want to stick around for that little follow-up conversation, you can hang out for a little bit. Just want to share a couple of quick things with you all. mostly just want to share an appreciation for Molly, for Brenda, and for everybody who came today to just engage in this conversation. Thank you so much. Took so much from this conversation, feeling inspired, and just have a lot to think about. So thank you. We want to just quickly ask for your feedback. So there's a link in the chat if you would not mind giving us a bit of feedback about today. There's also in that survey a way that you can sign up to get to connect with Diversity Talks. So you can sign up to connect with them via email. You can sign up to get more information about some of the free resources that they're offering and some of the special events they're offering this month. So please do that if you're interested. We'd love that. There's also a sign up for our Core Advocates Network, which can allow you to find out more about more events like this one, if you're interested in that. We so appreciate you all and know that we are out of time. Please leave a little bit of feedback if you can, and some thank yous to Molly and Brenda for joining us today. Really appreciate you all, and thanks so much.